Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another installment of Big Money Buys. If you've never seen this series before, essentially what we attempt to do is to run down those comics that have been sold on eBay for lots of money, hence the name Big Money Buys. Before we jump into the list, there are a few things that I want to mention from the top. One of those things is that for the first month since we started this series, we have actually seen the Big Money Buys trend downward. Put another way, books are not selling for as much above FMV as they have been, which may be a good thing, or it could just be one specific month that is off. Another thing, we are actually seeing some DC comics make the list. Historically, this list has been dominated by Marvel Comics, fueled by the movies and the TV shows, but we actually see some DC comics on this month's list, which again, I think is a really good thing. One of the other things that I want to throw out to you is that eBay has continued to make modifications to some of the data that we have access to. And this comes into play with the make an offer function. A lot of times people put out comics and there is an offer that is made, an offer that is accepted, and then we have the ability to go through a portal to actually see what that final price was for that comic. eBay has shut that down, and so we don't have access to that information. With that said, we have continued to put books on the list based upon the asking price, but we do not know what the final price was for that comic. So how this plays out is that if the actual data is ever revealed, we might see the rank order of some books on the list change. We are making the assumption, however, that when an offer is made, it is actually close to the asking price. So in the spirit of transparency, we kind of offer up this caveat to you. The very last thing that I want to make mention of is that there is something associated with Iron Man's origin that should have made the list but didn't make the list. And if that sounds a little cryptic, it is on purpose. So I definitely want to encourage you to stay tuned until the end of the video so that we can actually reveal what this Iron Man origin is all about. Number 10 on the list is Giant Size X-Men issue number 1. And this book was actually sold for $12,619 on May 23rd. This CGC 9.2 with white pages was sold after 24 bids as an auction. And this is honestly a really awesome copy of this comic. And you'll see that someone may have actually scored a pretty sweet deal on this when we look at book number 7 on the list. One of the other things that I want to mention here is that X-Men, just in general, whether you're talking about Giant Size X-Men or X-Men issue number 1, those books have been regulars on this list for some time. And in 1 month, they pretty much dominated the entire top 10. That's how just interested, I guess, people are in the X-Men and mutants. Number 9 on the list is our first DC comic, and we are specifically talking about Detective Comics issue number 140. And this book sold for $12,999 as a buy it now on May 25th. And this CGC 4.5 with white pages is the first appearance of a classic character, that being the Riddler. And this book was released in 1948. When you dig into the data, what you'll see is that there are 18 CGC 4.5s on the census, with only 67 copies higher graded than this book. And I'll also highlight that there is actually a 9.6 on the list, which is very interesting. Considering the scarcity of this book and the importance of this first appearance, this might actually be a pretty awesome buy. I'm honestly not sure how often this book actually comes up, but this might be considered a solid buy, even though it sold for $4,000 more than the current FMV. Number 8 on the list is Fantastic Four issue number 1. And this book is a restored copy of FF1 and sold for $9,000 less than an unrestored copy, and might be a sign of how collectors and investors are actually viewing restored versus unrestored copies. This book sold on May 20th for $13,221 as an auction with 45 bidders. It was a CBCS 4.5 and, as I mentioned, restored copy with off-white pages. The other thing that I want to mention to you is the type of restoration that we see with this book. This was actually an amateur restoration with slight color touch on the cover, tear seals on the cover, and small pieces, one small piece, I think, added to the back cover to reattach it. So we're not talking about major restoration here, but again, $9,000 difference between these books. Number 7 on the list is another copy of Giant Size X-Men issue number 1. And this book had a total of 50 bidders on May 9th that drove the price to $13,600. This copy is a CGC 9.2 with off-white pages, but also has an older label, which again is a signal for a lot of people that maybe this is a book that was never cleaned or pressed, and therefore could represent some hidden value if it were cracked, cleaned, pressed, and regraded. And maybe that's why we saw so many people actually bid on this copy and also for the price. To that point, this book sold for 20% higher than the current GoCollect FMV. As mentioned, the 10th book on the list sold for $1,000 less with better page quality, but potentially what people saw in this book was essentially what I alluded to a short while ago, an opportunity to actually crack this book open and potentially get a nice grade bump. Only time will tell, of course, whether that actually happens, and we'll probably not even be privy to it. But again, this is the fun of tracking some of these type of big money buys. Number 6 on the list is Fantastic Four issue number 1. And for a lot of people, this book signals the beginning of the Silver Age. This specific copy sold on May 9th for $16,100 with a total of 40 bids on the CGC 4.0 with cream to off-white pages. When you dig into the data, what you see is that there are 169 copies of this book on the CGC census, with approximately 475 copies graded higher than this specific copy. What's crazy is that there are actually 2 CGC 9.6s on the census. Just crazy to think about how high grade this book is and its age. It is really impressive to actually think about, and I love to actually just hold it one time. With that said, let's get to the next book on the list. Number 5 on the list is X-Men issue number 1, and this is a CGC 8.0 but a restored copy, and we'll talk about the type of restoration here in just a moment. This book actually sold for $19,995 as a best offer on May 4th. And as I mentioned, we actually don't know what the final price was paid for this book, but still represents a healthy asking price, and we are assuming that the book sold for something near that asking price. When we look a little bit further into this listing, what we see is that this CGC 8.0 purple label had cream to off-white pages and actually included restoration to the tune of a small amount of color touch on the cover, a tear seal, and also cover cleaning and cover reinforced. Now, I want to point out here that according to GoCollect, a CGC 8.0 unrestored or a blue label of X-Men issue number 1 actually has a value of $88,000. So you're talking about a large delta between a blue label and a purple label for X-Men issue number 1. And again, this might be how it is that collectors and investors are actually thinking about how to value these two types of comics. Number 4 on the list is the first appearance of Victor Von Doom. That's right, Fantastic Four issue number 5. And this specific copy actually sold on May 8th for $21,000 as a buy it now. Now, I want to point out here that GoCollect actually has the FMV of this book at a 5.0 at only $10,000. So that's a healthy sales price versus the actual FMV. Now, what's interesting is that the seller ended up relisting this book a few days later after it sold. So we aren't certain really whether they had 2 copies of this book or if the buyer actually got smart and realized that they were paying basically double FMV. And so potentially we'll see whether this book appears on the list in subsequent months. Number 3 on the list is another copy of Fantastic Four issue number 1. And this copy actually sold for $21,100 as an auction on May 8th. There were a total of 45 bids on this specific copy, which was a CGC 4.0 blue label with cream to off-white pages. Now, what's important to note here is that GoCollect actually has this book's FMV right at $21,000, which might signal that someone actually scored pretty awesome on this book. And I say that because when you start to dig into the data, what you actually see is that a lot of Silver Age books are actually selling for anywhere between 50 to 200% above their FMV. So the fact that someone scored a classic Silver Age book right at FMV might actually be a really good buy for them. Number 2 on the list, Detective Comics issue number 33. And this low-grade yet awesome copy of this comic sold on May 4th for $21,991. And this book actually sold as a best offer. So again, we actually don't know what the final price was, but wanted to represent it on the list because it's a pretty awesome big money buy. So that's part of the reason why we included it. This CGC 1.5 with cream to off-white pages was published in 1939 and is the first origin of Batman and includes the murder of Thomas and Martha Wayne. There is currently no established GoCollect FMV for this book, but we should point out that there are a total of 57 Blue Label Detective Comics issue number 33 on the CGC census. And the number 1 book on the list, published in 1939, is Action Comics issue number 7. This is a book in my mind that you might expect to see on like a Comic Link or Heritage versus eBay, yet here we are. This specific copy sold for $27,500 as a best offer on May 4th. And again, we don't know exactly how much it sold for, but we can assume that it was probably pretty close to that asking price. This CGC 1.5 with cream to off-white pages was a conserved copy. The cover had been cleaned, the spine was completely split, and the back cover was also detached, When you dig into the data, what you see is that there are a total of 54 copies of this book on the CGC census, with only 32 of them receiving a blue label. Really, really awesome book that, again, you don't see come up for sale all that often. In fact, GoCollect doesn't even have an FMV for this book. That's how rare it is, but you can actually use the modeler to actually triangulate what the price of this comic might be, because it doesn't appear all that often. So at the beginning of this video, we threw out a little bit of a mystery regarding the origin of Iron Man. And so now we are going to reveal what we are talking about. Specifically, a page from Iron Man issue #1 from 1968. Specifically, an original art page was actually sold on eBay. We are talking about page 1, the splash page from the second story in the book, The Origin of Iron Man. This is an item that you don't necessarily expect to see on eBay. This is something in my mind that you would normally see on like a Heritage or Comic Link or something like that, if you even see it in public, because a lot of times original art pages are actually sold person to person and not necessarily just through a marketplace. But 110 bids is a lot for this. When you dig into some of the details, what you see is that the sales price for this was $32,655. Hands down, the single highest sold item that we actually tracked. And so again, this, if it were a comic, would have absolutely made the list, but it's original art, and we don't necessarily track original art, but we do like to highlight big money buys that have appeared on eBay. With that said, I'm going to wrap this video up. I hope that you guys enjoyed this installment. And if you did, I certainly want to encourage you to hit the thumbs up button and let us know in the comment section what you think of this month's big money buys.